You're watching TV 20. We are Cleveland.
This is the Cleveland Stories dinner party, so we're not going to spend a lot of time about his Chicago years. And, I think everybody has seen probably The Untouchables and know that that was linked to, Prohibition and Al Capone and shutting that down. But, in fact, one of the things I came across was that he became so famous so quickly, and he was in the Treasury Department, folks, but he was a federal agent, that J. Edgar Hoover actually kind of shut down his federal career. I mean, just really blocked this guy because he became so internationally famous so quickly. Isn't that correct?
Well, he did have a very good reputation when he came out of Chicago, even though he was only 32 years old. And when he was with the Treasury Department, when Prohibition was repealed, he went to the alcohol tax unit of the Treasury Department and worked in Cincinnati for a short while, but he didn't care for that. And so luckily for him, he got a transfer to Cleveland.
But in the same department. I mean, he was still Treasury
same
here.
Department, yeah.
For over a year here, right?
Right, for a year, 1934, yes. And he was in charge of 30 men in our alcohol tax unit when Mayor Harold Burton noticed in him somebody honest and just the right kind of guy to tap for a safety director.
All right. Now, again, very young guy still at that time. In fact, he was like 33 years old when he became the safety director. Kind of describe Cleveland. Why did he want this very honest guy? I mean, folks, this is really the truth. I mean,
right. Well, Mayor Harold Burton was elected on a reform ticket because Cleveland at that time was the #1 most dangerous city in the country. And we were the 5th largest, but we were #1 for murder, rape, robbery, juvenile crime, and automobile accidents. So it wasn't real good. Yay. So the Chamber of Commerce probably whispered to Mayor Burton, hey, let's turn this around. And so why on earth Eliot Ness would want that job as safety director in the most dangerous city, I can't imagine, except that we had nowhere to go but up. We were so bad.
But, I mean, I read a couple of accounts. I mean, it was brutally bad. This city was so over-the-top corrupt in those days. I mean, you might refer, you saw some scenes in The Untouchables about Al Capone, and it wasn't even close to how brutal it was and how corrupt it was, even in Chicago. But in Cleveland, it was over the top. Most of, I was reading that almost every single precinct in the city was run by the mob, and every single one of them, their partner was the local police sergeant. I mean, every single police officer in the city was so corrupt, it was off the charts.
That's true. And one of the first things Eliot Ness did was a major house cleaning within the police department. And a lot of high-ranking captains and so on found themselves on their way to the state penitentiary. They weren't just out of a job, they were on their way to the state pen. And when word got around that he wasn't going to mess around, they just started quitting. So he really had a big turnaround. And he established our very first police
This was a
academy.
young guy.
I know. Man, the chief of police was older than Eliot Ness's father, but he had to answer to Eliot Ness. But they had a good relationship, and things really did happen well and quickly because he just, he was hired to do a job, and he was going to do it, by gum. A lot of the organized crime were, very deeply into the labor unions. And one story is interesting. I mean, who hasn't eaten Stouffer's food? So Vernon and Gordon Stouffer had built a very good restaurant system here in Cleveland. They were just in their early years, but it was doing very well. But all of a sudden, they found their big plate glass windows in front of their beautiful restaurants were being broken. But the Glaziers Union was in cahoots with the mob, and so unless they paid their protection fee to be left alone, their windows would be broken, and then there wasn't a glazier in town who would fix the windows. So, you know, Eliot Ness had that to deal with too, all these protection scams that were going on around the city. But he investigated, and within only 3 short months of time, those mobsters were on their way to the state pen. It was getting crowded at the time. But it's kind of nice because when actually Eliot Ness had them in the back of a cruiser, there were some other mobsters who thought it'd be funny to rent a brass band and sit in a convertible car behind and have a brass band like they were making a parade out of them going to the state pen. But I think that wouldn't be too funny if I was on the way there. Well, there's one story, too, about a police officer whom I met who, it was years ago, and he was quite elderly when I met him, but he said that his beat was around Shaker Square towards the Cleveland side. And he said there were mobsters there who would go into the really poor sections of town, and they would do the numbers racketeering. What they had was a velvet bag, and inside were a bunch of balls. And then you would bet your week's salary, which at that time, it was the Depression and people were really starving. They would bet that, you know, they had a 50-50 chance of getting an even or an odd ball. But what they didn't know was that the balls were either convex or concave. And so when the gangster was reaching into the bag, he could feel and decide if you're going to win or not. You know, he didn't have to look in the bag, and he'd pull out and say, oops, you just lost your, week's salary. And people were gambling just for the sake of doubling their money, hopefully. And that police officer told me, he said it was really awesome that he told Eliot Ness what was going on in his neighborhood with this numbers racketeering. And Eliot Ness actually went down, found the guys who were doing that, went up to them and said, you know what, these people can't afford to lose their money because this is feeding their families. So go and do it in another neighborhood where your people are living and where you can afford to lose your money. And they respected Eliot Ness, which is kind of odd, but they did. Well, we didn't have a motorcycle unit at the time, and other big cities did. And he thought, well, we were kind of poor. We only had 32 police cruisers. So he thought by establishing a motorcycle unit, they could go in and out of a traffic situation and not have to tie up one of the cruisers. And that was great. We had had a mounted unit since 200 some years ago when the city first started, but during the Depression, it had fallen by the wayside. And I asked an officer why that was, and he said, well, people don't think about the fact that the officers on the horse are on the city payroll, but the horses aren't. And they're expensive to feed and care for. So Eliot Ness went to a private family in Cleveland, and that same family is still supporting the mounted unit, along with a lot of other people, too. So he also knew that our cruisers, the officers were getting out of the police car to go up to an old Murphy call box. Remember that from the Little Rascals and Three Stooges, where they had that blue box and they'd open it, turn a crank, and that would ring bells at the station to say there was trouble on that corner. But they didn't know what trouble. Do you need an ambulance, a fire engine, or what? So he established two-way radios in the cars, because again, they were out there for other cities, but we didn't have two-way radios. And he even wrote an article in American City Magazine, Eliot Ness did, saying how it's increased the speed and efficiency beyond anything believed possible. So it really made a difference. But he established our very first police training academy and modeled it after the FBI's. He insisted that every candidate for police should have an even temperament, and he made certain that the civil service test was a little more difficult to pass. And he also insisted that all of them should be in good physical condition. And he didn't ask anything of them that he didn't demand of himself. And so he regularly worked out at the Dewey Mitchell Health Club in the Standard Building, which is being renovated right now, but they said they're going to bring back the health club. So that's nice.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, but he also got involved on the fire side, didn't he?
Yeah, the fire department was also under the safety director, and he made certain that the fire department, he started the EMS. We didn't have that before he came, and he made certain that the ambulances at the time, which really looked a lot like a station wagon to me, but the ambulances would be out and available in the neighborhoods. We had way too many districts at the time, and Eliot Ness drew the boundaries for 6 districts during his tenure. And you know, to this day, those 6 districts have changed only very little in the boundaries, which is interesting that he had such an eye to the future that way.
Let's go back to some stories about, when he was the safety director in Cleveland, other things that he took on or other, criminals that he took on and took down. I mean, I'm sure you have lots of those stories.
Well, I think an interesting one is really not so much for hardened criminals, but the juvenile crime. That during the Great Depression, juvenile crime was terrible. But again, my grandmother with her stories, she would say that the Depression drove good men to do bad things. And there were stories of children who would go and steal a chicken out of the neighbor's yard, because back then you could have chickens in your yard in the city, because the family was hungry. Or a man might steal a bottle of milk off a neighbor's porch thinking, well, they don't have kids and we do, and the kids are starving. So people were stealing from each other. Kids were really starting to get badly into a life of crime, and our juvenile crime was out of control in Cleveland. So you know what he did was he formed Boy Scout troops. And he asked all of his police officers to host a Boy Scout troop. And they were all over the city, any empty church basement, any social hall, any empty school classroom, whatever. Boy Scout troops were all over the city, and he had thousands of children who were otherwise on the street, were being taught lessons about right and wrong and how to earn money, how to go and buy apples down at the Central Market here and selling them in their neighborhood for a couple pennies more so they could make a profit and earn a living, and teaching them a lot of good things like that. And, bless the hearts of those police officers to volunteer and really get behind it. In fact, Eliot Ness became the national head of the Boy Scouts of America while he was here in Cleveland. So that was kind of nice. He always had a soft spot for children. When he lived out in Bay Village, like I said, he lived in a little cottage behind the garage, but the main house, which is rather modest and still standing there, was a man named Robert Chamberlain, who became his first assistant safety director. And Robert Chamberlain had some young children, and it was often said that Eliot Ness would sometimes come home from work and go knock on the Chamberlain's back door and just say, "Can I play with your children?" And he'd kick off his shoes and get on the floor and play with the children. And it's too bad that with all 3 wives, he wasn't able to have any children. Although with his 3rd wife, he did adopt a little boy named Robert. And he was from an orphanage in Ashtabula.
Great Lakes Brewery. I don't know how that's a question, or she's ordering a
It
beer.
is. I already know the question. Well, Pat Conway and I have an agreement. I said, he can tell his stories there, but if anybody asks me the truth, I will tell you the truth. And I was actually with our safety director in Great Lakes Brewery to look at the bullets that are in the back bar, and there's no way it was the same caliber that Eliot Ness was issued. And no way was anyone shooting at the safety director, Eliot Ness, at that time. I met a woman years ago who told me her grandfather put those bullets in the back bar at Great Lakes Brewery. And her story makes a lot of sense, because her grandfather was the night watchman for Fries and Sheely department store, which is right next to Great Lakes Brewery, and it was his job to take the daily receipts to the bank on the corner of Lorraine and West 25th. That's a restaurant now. Well, he would often stop at the brewery, which at that time was not a nice restaurant like it is today. It was just a neighborhood bar, which Eliot Ness would never have gone into. He liked his cocktails downtown, but he was not going into any sleazy, no offense to whoever owned it at the time, in the 30s, neighborhood bar, because that's what it was. And she said, this woman told me that her grandfather admitted he was kind of showing off one night and, set off his gun a couple times in the bar. It was what the caliber is, what they said was either a lady's handgun or a watchman's gun at the time. So that makes sense, but absolutely no connection with Eliot Ness.
Still, we have Eliot Ness on tap.
Yeah, we do. And it's a good beer. I like it.
Yeah.
But
Right,
there is,
so-
I will say one thing, there is a connection with Great Lakes and Eliot Ness, and that is that Pat Conway's mother, Margaret Conway, was one of the stenographers in Eliot Ness's office as safety director, so she did work for him.
So 7 years, and you've mentioned a lot of accomplishments. Tell a little bit about what happened after he left Cleveland.
Well, after he left Cleveland,
Because he actually left and came back, didn't he?
yeah, he did. And I should say first that his tenure as safety director ended, no offense to him, but every new mayor who comes in always chooses a safety director. I've never been wrong. Watch, 24 hours, when a new mayor's in, within 24 hours, the first thing they announce is a new safety director. And when Mayor Frank Lausche came in, he chose one himself, as others had done. And that was okay with Eliot Ness because he had a college degree, and he thought he'd like to go into business because that was what his major was in college, business and economics. So he took a job at the Diebold Company, and the Diebold Company is down in Canton, still is. Their name's on pretty much any safe or ATM machine to see now. And they had been kind of down on their luck during the Depression, and they really needed some new guidance. So he helped them a lot. He loved Cleveland so much, though, he commuted to Canton every day, and that's saying something because they hadn't built 77 yet. So that must have been a rough commute for him, but he did it. He had moved over to the east side of town at that point. But yeah, after the Diebold Company, and when the war broke out, he actually worked in Washington, D.C. for a short while, and he wrote pamphlets on how soldiers should protect themselves from venereal disease. I don't know how he was an expert on that, but he did write books on that topic. But that career... Safety director, safety, yeah. So after, the war and all that, then he did come back to Cleveland. He was still with the Diebold Company again and still loved Cleveland so much that it really wasn't until a friend of his had told him about a job in Coudersport, Pennsylvania with a Guarantee Paper and Fidelity Company, because they had come up with a new idea that they thought was just perfect for him, because there was a little bit of detective work, but a little bit of business. And what they had come up with was the process of watermarking paper to prevent forgery. And he thought, this is the thing of the future. And he was right. There's not an important paper or a dollar bill in your billfold that isn't watermarked to prevent forgery. And so he picked up his wife and moved to Coudersport, Pennsylvania then.
And worked for them. But wait a minute, I thought he at one point ran for a political office.
That's right, yeah. While he was working at Diebold, he was asked to run for mayor in 1947. And
Of Cleveland, right?
Of Cleveland.
Yeah.
He was running against the incumbent, Tom Burke, and they said they just really needed a powerful name on the Republican ticket because, it looked like Tom Burke was probably going to win. So he thought, why would I bother? And he really was kind of not politically motivated. He didn't care if a person was Republican or Democrat so long as they were honest. But he thought, well, all right. He got worn down, and so he did run for mayor, and he, shook hands at the West Side Market, and he went in parades and people's backyards. In fact, there was a billboard on the side of a building in Cedar that was up decades after he died. But yeah, he was soundly defeated 2-1, just like it was predicted, and he was okay with that because his heart really wasn't in the job anyway.
And then he left for Pennsylvania.
Right, and then he left for Pennsylvania, yes.
All righty.
Yeah.
Now, but what happened there, really? I mean, there's some, because
In
that did,
Coudersport?
yeah, because that company did not take off, even it was.
If you've ever been to Coudersport, and I was lucky enough to go there once, it's about 6 hours east of here, in the middle of absolute nowhere. I'm not kidding, First and Main, and a little bit around that is the city. It's tiny, tiny. But the reason the big paper companies are there are because of all the forests around there. So there's a lot of paper to be milled. And at the time, the Guaranteed Paper Company had come up with a concept and were thinking about it, but they hadn't actually retooled the machinery. And when they started looking into it, they realized that, gosh, this is going to be expensive to retool and to do watermarking on all this paper that they're putting out. And they were really on the fence about it, and Eliot Ness so believed in it, he did what Grandma always said don't do. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, but he did. He invested every penny he had in the Guaranteed Paper Company, hoping it would be a success. And it was at that same time, that one year that he lived in Coudersport, that a friend of his, Oscar Fraley, who was a journalist, talked him into writing a book about his memoirs and said, you know, it'd be fun to write a book about your time in Chicago with Prohibition and all that. And there are letters at the Western Reserve Historical Society where Eliot Ness kind of said back and forth to Oscar, like, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. I was only in the Prohibition Bureau about 2 years, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. And Oscar Fraley said, no, I really think it would be. You write me a little something, and, you know, we'll turn it into a book. And Eliot Ness said, but I'm not a writer. I don't know how to write a book. And Oscar
About
Fraley,
venereal disease, he did. I don't know.
yeah, really. Nowadays. But Oscar said, don't worry about that. I'll write the book. You just send me a little something, and I'll let you know when I've got a chapter done and I'm ready for some more. So it went on for about a year. Eliot would send him things, and Oscar would say, that's great, send me some more. And another month would go by, send me some more. And after a year, Oscar said, well, the book is done. We're going to call it The Untouchables, because Eliot was nicknamed an untouchable in Chicago because he wouldn't take a bribe. And so when Oscar sent Eliot the what we call galley edition, it was finished but not printed yet as a book, Eliot read it and said, this isn't what I sent you. This isn't my story. And Oscar said, tough. You don't like it, you can write off the rights to it. But I think it's going to be a bestseller. And Eliot said, I don't want anything to do with this. This isn't my story. So he wrote off all rights to it for $300 because he needed the money. So there was no rights, no royalties to Eliot Ness. Once that book hit the presses, Oscar was right. It was a runaway bestseller. And that very same year, 1956, Desilu Productions bought the rights to the book, hired Robert Stack to portray him, and the rest is history. That show has never left TV ever since. It's on a cable channel somewhere constantly. It's the longest running TV show ever. But Eliot Ness didn't know the book was a runaway bestseller because that was the same year he died from a heart attack. He was only 54.
In Pennsylvania, right? It was
in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. Right. When A&E Biography came here to film the biography of Eliot Ness, I took off 3 or 4 days of work, drove all around the city, showed him where he lived, where he worked, told him everything I knew. And I said, the one thing I don't know is, where is he buried? Where are his ashes? I knew his widow could only afford to cremate him, but whatever happened to the ashes, I didn't know. So a year after the A&E Biography aired, I get a call out of the blue from one of the producers. And he said it bothered him that I didn't know that, and he did. So he said, it was very mysterious. He said, I'm going to give you a woman's name and a phone number, and the rest is up to you. So I called her, and I said, well, you don't know me, but And I said, I understand you have the ashes. And she said, yes, she had Eliot Ness's ashes along with his widow and their adopted son's ashes, and they were in her garage out in Lake County. And I said, I'm on the board of trustees for the police museum. It would really be great if he could have an honorable funeral. We would pull out all the stops and really make it good. And it took me a year to wear her down before she decided she would trust me with his ashes. I met her in a downtown hotel, the Wyndham Hotel. She wanted me to meet her in the lobby of a hotel, and I thought, well, all right, but I'm going to have a couple of police with me, and I did. And she was very nice, but hesitant, and she said, she would give me the ashes. And so then I pulled together Treasury Department, FBI, Secret Service, of course, Cleveland Police, every unit, and it took a year to plan his funeral. I decided Lakeview Cemetery was best because it is an historical cemetery here in Cleveland, and it just seemed right. The one restriction she gave me when she gave me the ashes was that it must be dispersed in water. She wouldn't tell me why.
Who is she? I mean, yeah, who is she and how did she gain control of the ashes?
Good question. I was sworn to secrecy, but I would have had to kill you again, but I know. But don't tell a soul that I told you this. No, actually, it has been published in books since. She's very private, but she is a lady who married Eliot Ness's adopted son, Robert. Now, when Eliot Ness died, I should tell you, Robert was 10 years old. And his widow, Elizabeth, took Robert back here to Cleveland. They were so destitute, they took an apartment on Huff Avenue, which wasn't as bad as it is now, but it wasn't very good at the time. And she lived with another lady who was once a housekeeper at City Hall. She did a good job raising Robert, and he was able to even take some classes at the brand new Cleveland State University. And unfortunately, when he was about 19, he contracted leukemia. And he was getting treatments at university hospitals. And one of the nurses there who was giving him his treatments, sparks flew, and they really fell in love. And they're so positive that he was going to get better that they got married. But unfortunately, when they came back from the honeymoon, the leukemia came back and took him. So he died very young. And that young widow had the ashes of Eliot Ness because Robert had been holding them for 20 years until he died. And then she had the ashes of her young husband. She never married again. That was some honeymoon, I tell you. Never married again. And then, so she is the one who was holding the ashes all these years. And she just didn't know what to do with them, where to bury them or where to put them. Why water, I don't know, except that I know one thing that Eliot Ness would do to really relax where he didn't feel threatened was to ride the C&B or C&D or the Aquarama. He would get on the boat, do the circle, and come back. He didn't get off in Detroit or Buffalo. He just did the circle and came back because that's where he could really put down his guard.
Well, so how did you solve that in the burial? How did you solve?
Well, at Lakeview Cemetery, they have Wade Lake and the pond. I'm forgetting the first name of the pond. The pond across is actually runoff from the Heights, which goes out to the lake. But Wade Lake is a self-contained spring-fed pond. And I thought, ooh, that sounds nice. I think he should be buried in Wade Lake. And so I asked the director of the cemetery, and he said, well, we've had a 140-year policy that no one may ever be buried in Wade Lake. And I asked, will you make an exception? And he said, yes.
Oh, yeah.
He went to the trustees, and they said yes. So Eliot Ness was the first one ever to be buried in Wade Lake. And we had a really nice funeral for him. I chose the date, ironically, September 10th, but it was 1997. And over 2,000 people came, international media. He's huge in Great Britain and Australia and Japan. Don't ask me why, it's TV.
Right, exactly. Good question out there. That's fantastic.